Bombshell tonight in the Nolan Wells investigation. Tonight, the timeline seemingly blows up. This as Nolan's mother is investigated. Why? And tonight, possibly even more important, where is Nolan's phone?
What the agreement was that the DA's office, and this is the Jackson County DA's office, as well as our forensic team, and possibly the FBI, were going to together download and examine the phone. So it's done one time with everybody together, right? This is very common in the law. I mean, what you all may be more used to is when there's a terrible car accident, and then there's an examination of that car, and everybody comes together one time. They don't move that car around, and everybody does their own thing. This is what is supposed to happen. We are waiting for the DA to determine the time, the place, the date. Let us know, and we are going to be there with our forensics team and anybody else, but it's done one time, one examination. We're ready for it to happen.
Nolan's birthday is next Wednesday, August 19th. It is going to be extremely difficult for his mother, his father, and his family, because this August 19th will be like no other that they've ever had for the last 19 years. I mean, it's a milestone when your child gets to be 18 years old. You try to breathe a little easier every now. You say, man, we almost got them there. They're at the cusp of being an adult, cusp of manhood.
As a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, I'm the second vice chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. We are demanding a full federal investigation. Kash Patel, we're demanding a full federal investigation as to what has actually happened to Nolan Wells. We want to make sure that every stone is unturned because his life matters. All of our children's and our families' lives matter. And we must fight back. We must stand up, and we must demand accountability for this family's loss.
It has been more than a month since 18-year-old Nolan Wells was pulled from the water off Horn Island, Mississippi, and there is still no phone in the hands of investigators. Not the sheriff's office, not the FBI. A national legal commentator is asking a former police officer, on camera, a question nobody has answered cleanly. If the family wants justice, why does the one object that could prove or disprove a deleted message theory still not exist inside an evidence locker? Two camps have now formed around a single missing device, and this week, both of them started producing receipts. If you're new here, that's exactly what we're going to sort through today, calmly, with sources named, and without pretending we already know the ending before the evidence does. Before we get into it, a quick note. Every claim in this video is going to be marked as confirmed, disputed, or still unknown, because in a case that's contested, that distinction is a whole ball game. We have been tracking Nolan Wells since July, and we are one of a shrinking number of channels still checking every claim against a name and a date before we put it in front of you. If that sounds like your kind of true crime channel, that's exactly why we exist, and it's worth sticking around for what happens after this update airs. We put a lot of hours into these breakdowns, and honestly, our subscriber count still hasn't caught up to how many of you are watching every video. If today's update earns it, hit subscribe before we go further, because we've got a lot more of this case still to cover. Before the phone, before the attorneys arguing over what prepare to cooperate actually means, before Officer Tatum went at it with Don Lemon's team, and Nancy Grace ran her own panel on the exact same question. Before any of that, there was a kid who cooked salmon for his mother the night before a holiday weekend because it was one of her favorite things, and he wanted to do something nice before he left for the beach. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should, Christine Wonsley has repeated it in nearly every interview she's given since her son's death, not because it's dramatic, but because it's the last full memory she has of him that has nothing to do with any of this. A hug, a kiss, an ordinary, "I love you, Mom, I'm about to go." 18 years old, an Ocean Springs High School graduate, a wide receiver who had just started his football career at Southwest Mississippi Community College. Friends who knew him for years described someone who almost never got angry, who acted as a peacemaker any time tension flared inside his friend group, and who, according to more than one person who grew up around him, was the kind of person who could talk two rivals into becoming friends by the end of the same conversation. His mother has said he was constantly taking pictures and videos at every gathering he attended, to the point where family members expected it. That detail is going to matter a great deal later in this video, so hold on to it. His best friend Javon Williams, who gave an on-record interview to Biloxi's Sun Herald and later spoke to CNN, described a specific, consistent pattern in Nolan's behavior that has become one of the more quietly important details in this entire case. Williams said he had never once known Nolan to stay behind when his ride was leaving, describing him as someone who, in his words, always came back with whoever he rode out with every single time, as a matter of habit rather than exception. That is not proof of anything on its own. People break their own patterns constantly, for reasons as simple as meeting someone they liked on a crowded beach. But it is a kind of detail that a close friend, speaking under his own name to two separate news organizations, chose to volunteer without being pushed toward it. And it is exactly the sort of texture that gets lost when a case gets compressed into a single headline. Multiple people who knew him described a similar picture. He was the kind of teenager who showed up in nearly every photo his friends posted, not because he inserted himself into frames, but because he was simply always around, always part of whatever was happening. He had just started the process of exploring an Army recruitment path alongside his football career, according to family statements, still building out what his life after high school was going to look like. None of that made him unusually newsworthy before July 4th. It made him ordinary in the way most 18-year-olds with their whole lives still ahead of them are ordinary, and that ordinariness is worth sitting with for a moment before the case takes over the rest of the story, because it is easy, 5 weeks and dozens of press conferences into a case like this one, to stop picturing an actual person and start picturing only a set of contested facts. He spent July 3rd running errands with friends, picking up boat parts, staying overnight at a friend's house the way he apparently did constantly, according to those same friends. On the morning of July 4th, he headed out to Horn Island, a barrier island roughly 10 miles off the Mississippi Gulf Coast, reachable only by private boat, and by every account, the single biggest party destination on the Gulf Coast for that holiday. Friends who have spoken publicly described this as an annual tradition for their group, not a one-off outing, and say they had already been to Horn Island multiple times that same year with Nolan along for every trip. What is confirmed through Mississippi Department of Marine Resources GPS records obtained by CBS News is that the boat Nolan traveled on left its dock at 9:56 that morning and arrived at Horn Island at 11:14. Nolan was last seen by friends and by a young woman named Katie, whose account we'll return to later, at approximately 3 o'clock that afternoon. Sometime after that, according to the account given by the friends who were with him, a bilge pump failure caused water to start filling the boat, and the group made the decision to leave the island early. Records show that boat departing Horn Island at 4:31 in the afternoon. Nolan did not leave with them. A recording obtained by NBC News through a public records request captures part of the call one of the friends made to a private towing service, describing the boat as sinking and confirming everyone aboard was accounted for and in good health. That confirmation that everyone aboard was fine becomes one of the most argued over sentences in this entire case, because Nolan, by every account given publicly, was not on that boat when it made that call, and multiple listeners of the full recording have noted the audio is intermittent and difficult to parse cleanly in places, consistent with the notoriously spotty cell coverage the friend group has repeatedly described around Horn Island. According to the GPS data obtained by CBS News from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, the boat carrying Nolan's friends returned to its original dock at approximately 5:44 that evening. then traveled into nearby Fort Bayou around 5:52, before returning to the dock again at 6:06. Later that evening, records show the boat entering the Fort Bayou boat launch at 7:19, before what the state's own report describes as travel over land, presumably by trailer, back to the boat owner's residence in Biloxi. That stretch of movement, roughly an hour and 40 minutes between leaving Horn Island and finally reaching the boat launch at night, has been highlighted by several commentators as worth scrutinizing on its own terms, since a direct return trip covering that distance would ordinarily take considerably less time. The friend's own account attributes that gap to the emergency itself, stopping partway to reinsert the bilge plug once the boat was safely on plane, along with a general slower, more cautious pace anyone would reasonably take while nursing a boat that had just nearly taken on water. As of this recording, no official law enforcement statement has offered a competing explanation for that specific window, which means it remains an open question rather than a settled one in either direction. One of Nolan's friends contacted the Coast Guard around 11 o'clock that night. His mother reported him missing shortly after. Searches involving the Coast Guard, the Department of Marine Resources, the National Park Service, and volunteer groups, including the United Cajun Navy, launched the following morning. On July 6th, a National Park Service ranger found his body in the water off the island's northwestern tip. It's worth noting, because this detail rarely makes it into shorter recaps of this case, that Nolan's own friends did not sit out that search. Warren, along with two other friends identified as Wyatt and Trace, took a boat out themselves the following morning and were met on the water by 7 separate Department of Marine Resources vessels already working the area, along with park rangers who took down their information and confirmed they had been with Nolan the day before. Other friends searched separately in a second boat, joined at points by family members, and the group has described coordinating informally with each other on which stretches of coastline and open water to cover, working alongside a former high school coach of Nolan's, who had reportedly already covered sections of the island on foot. One friend described following a rip current running between Horn Island and neighboring Ship Island for several miles, on the reasoning that a person in open water is most likely to end up caught in exactly that kind of current, and said they spoke with several independent fishing boats working that same stretch of water to ask whether anyone had seen anything unusual. None of that search activity, on its own, resolves any of the disputed questions in this case. But it is a confirmed on-the-record part what these specific young men did in the roughly 40 hours between Nolan being reported missing and his body being found, and it belongs in any complete account of this story. Jackson County Coroner Bruce Lynn told CNN there were no immediate signs of physical injury on the body. Identification was confirmed through dental records rather than a visual identification by a family member, which several outlets have noted typically indicates a body that had already spent significant time in the water. It's worth pausing on the sheriff's own language here, because it has genuinely shifted since those earliest days, and that shift matters more than most coverage gives it credit for. In an update roughly a week and a half into the investigation, Sheriff Ledbetter confirmed two things that had not been part of the public record before. His department had been conducting formal, separate witness interviews, and his office had been in direct contact with the FBI. He specifically credited public tips with moving the case forward in a real way and described the investigation, in his own words, as active and ongoing. That is a materially different posture than his office's original statement. To be clear about what FBI involvement does and does not mean here, because it gets overstated constantly online, Ledbetter has not said the Bureau has taken over the case, and nothing in his public statements suggests Jackson County has handed this investigation off to federal authorities. Horn Island sits on federal land within the Gulf Islands National Seashore, which on its own is a reasonable, unremarkable basis for federal involvement in a case of this scale, separate from any implication that federal agents have uncovered something the local sheriff's office hasn't. Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter said publicly, in the earliest days of this case, that there was no information at that point suggesting a crime had occurred. That statement, more than any other single sentence in this entire story, is what set off 5 weeks of escalating public scrutiny, Because to a grieving family, that statement landed like a door closing before the investigation had even started. The Wonsley family retained civil rights attorney Ben Crump. They arranged for an independent autopsy in Washington, D.C., funded in part by Colin Kaepernick. Separate from the official state examination, filmmaker Tyler Perry covered funeral costs. Reverend Al Sharpton stood alongside the family at a press conference in Harlem, and from that point forward, this stopped being a regional Mississippi story and became a national one, with millions of people forming opinions about a case where, even now, the official cause of death has still not been released to the public. That is, the skeleton of the case as it stood before the phone became the story. And it is worth being precise about that shift, because in the last several weeks, the center of gravity in this case has moved. It is no longer primarily about what happened on the water. It is about a single piece of evidence that both sides now say the other side is mishandling, and about two very different media ecosystems telling two very different versions of who is telling the truth about it. Before we get into that, let's clear away two pieces of viral evidence that dominated the first phase of this case, because you cannot understand why the phone fight matters so much without understanding what collapsed before it. The first was a photograph. It surfaced attached to an anonymous account's claim that Nolan had actually made it back to shore alive, attended a pool party, and was killed in an altercation there before his body was returned to the water. The photo appeared to show Nolan in a pool surrounded by a group of people, and within hours it had been viewed by hundreds of thousands of people. Ben Crump posted the image to his own account, with a caption explicitly noting he did not know whether the underlying claims were fact or rumor, and that his team was following every clue. Most of the internet skipped past that caveat entirely. Rolling Stone later obtained photo metadata from an independent source and published findings showing the photo was actually taken on June 27th, 8 days before the 4th of July, at a separate gathering in Pass Christian, Mississippi. A close friend of Nolan's named Trayston Shepard, who did not attend that particular party but recognized everyone in the photo, confirmed the date and the location to both Rolling Stone and ABC News. The theory built around that photograph did not survive contact with its own metadata. The second piece of viral evidence was a video. It captured a heated exchange near a boat, with a voice demanding, in essence, the return of a phone. Ben Crump described this footage to Good Morning America as showing Nolan in an argument, and said he believed the voice belonged to Nolan. That claim traveled everywhere. Then Trayston Shepard came forward to ABC News and identified himself as the voice in that recording, explaining he had been in a separate altercation with someone unrelated to Nolan while friends worked to calm him down and get him off the island. Shepard has since told multiple outlets he and others in the friend group have received death threats since Nolan's death, and he chose to speak to reporters anyway, on the record, under his own name, to correct that specific claim. We want to be precise here, because Ben Crump himself has since walked us back publicly, and the way he did it matters. At a subsequent press conference, when a reporter asked directly whether the voice on that video had been confirmed as Nolan's, Crump said that was what one witness had told his team at the time, that another witness has since come forward saying it is not Nolan's voice at all, and that his team will be more careful going forward to frame single witness accounts as exactly that, rather than presenting them as settled fact. That is a real correction made on the record, and it deserves to be treated as one rather than buried under the version of claim that already went viral weeks earlier. Two of the most emotionally powerful pieces of evidence in the early public narrative of this case have now been substantially undermined by the very people who first raised them. That does not mean nothing happened to Nolan Wells that day. It means the two loudest early theories about what happened were built on evidence that did not hold up, and that distinction should shape how skeptically you read everything that comes next in this video, including the claims from every side of the phone dispute we're about to walk through. If you've been following this case since the beginning, you already knew some of that. If you're catching this update fresh, you now have the floor under you to understand why the next fight, the one over Nolan's phone, has become the single most contested unresolved question in this entire investigation. Before we get into the phone itself, drop the word receipts in the comments if you caught both of those corrections, the photo and the video, because most people online only ever heard the original viral version and never heard either walk back. We want to know how many of you are actually getting the full picture instead of the version that went viral first.
We want the truth about what happened to Nolan Wells.
A Bertram boat was seen leaving shortly afterward at a high rate of speed. Pretty certain Nolan Wells was part of a group that was, quote, almost fighting around 5 p.m.
I'm on the side of finding out why everybody got back to the mainland except Nolan Wells.
I don't think they've cooperated at all. They do not have Nolan's phone. They haven't had access to Nolan's phone. The Jackson County Sheriff's Department has it. So how can you say that there's text missing or there's photographs missing? Our boys had no reason to do anything with Nolan's phone other than give it back to Christine and her friends later that night. So anything about missing text messages or Snapchats is completely false.
Big question. That is Tyler Cox representing the so-called friends of Nolan on Horn Island. And if he's claiming that no one see the phone, how does he know that something's not missing? So that's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Let's hear that one more time from our friend Dan Abrams.
I don't think they've cooperated at all. They do not have Nolan's phone. They haven't had access to Nolan's phone. The Jackson County Sheriff's Department has it. So how can you say that there's text missing or there's photographs missing? Our boys had no reason to do anything with Nolan's phone other than give it back to Christine and her friends later that night. So anything about missing text messages or Snapchats is completely false.
That's a veteran trial lawyer. That is Tyler Cox. He's representing the young men that were on the boat that took Nolan to Horn Island and came back without Nolan, according to them. Joining me in all-star panel, I'm not saying Cox is right or wrong, but what I am saying out to Brandon Tatum. Tatum, former police officer, Tucson, star of The Officer Tatum on YouTube. He has interviewed Nolan's acquaintances that were on the boat that day. Officer Tatum, thank you for being with us. Let me talk about this one moment. We've got so much to get to. I'm going to try to be brief. Tyler Cox stating, I don't think they cooperated at all. I think he's talking about Nolan's family. They, I guess the sheriff's office, haven't had access to Nolan's phone. Well, can't they subpoena that? It's called a subpoena ducis tecum. You're familiar with those. You've testified in court. A subpoena ducis tecum is, we hear about subpoenas for testimony. I've been subpoenaed. Yes, go to court and tell the truth. A subpoena ducis tecum is for an item, an object, a document. The sheriff can give out a subpoena ducis tecum or get a warrant for an object. So, you don't have it? Fine. Get it. Next. So how can you say I'm quoting, how can you say there's no text message or photo, as a text message or photos missing? Our boys had no reason to do anything with Nolan's phone other than give it back. So seeing anything about missing texts or Snapchats completely false. Well, according to the mom, Officer Tatum, she says that there was nothing sent out while Nolan was at Horn Island, which she found very odd. I have no reason to disbelieve her. So how can you say there were missing or there weren't missing? I don't think you can say it either way. Why don't they just get a search warrant and go get the phone? You know what? Forget all that. Officer Tatum, where is Nolan's phone? Do authorities have it?
Well, from my understanding, authorities do not have it, and the family have not been cooperating with authorities to give the phone over. According to the testimony or written statement from the lawyer that represents the family, the Nolan Wells family, he had made mention that he's prepared to cooperate, but they have not cooperated yet, which is very interesting to me. You want to find out what happened to your son. You would think you will be doing everything you can to cooperate. I can't judge her. I don't know what's in their mind, but it just seems to be very off-putting for them not to at least give the phone over and do what exactly they told the world they were going to do, and that is to allow a forensic extraction of his phone. Therefore, the world can see if there is things that have been deleted. I think Tyler Cox is very clear about what he's saying, that the boys had nothing to do with it. So if there is anything missing from the phone, it had nothing to do with them. Now, I'll add this. When you look at what Christine said.
Brandon, whoa, bit. I'm going to go right back to what you're saying, but you're saying a lot, and I want to address each thing so we don't leave anything out. Number one, you just stated that, basically. Correct me, you can paraphrase this any way you want to. It looks really bad for Nolan's family not to hand over the phone. Do you have any independent knowledge they have not handed over the phone?
According to their lawyer that wrote a statement, and the statement was, we're prepared to cooperate, but that was as of the 11th. Therefore, they have not cooperated. Tyler Cox has made mention that he don't believe they cooperated whatsoever. He don't believe they cooperated whatsoever as well. So
extrapolating, you're taking their words, Tatum, that their words that they're prepared to cooperate to mean they haven't handed over the phone. Isn't that true?
I'm putting everything together, right? We have Tyler Cox that's coming out and saying that he has no indication whatsoever they've cooperated. The family has not come out and said that there's any findings. And then also the attorney that represents the family is saying that we haven't sent or gave the phone over, but we're willing to. And that was as of the 11th.
No,
so it appears that there's no indication that.
Brandon, you may very well be a lot smarter than me, but I can hear. Okay. The statement was, we're prepared to cooperate, I guess from Crump. That does
I'm not sure
mean
if it was.
We have not handed over the phone, but we will.
Well, Nancy, when you put it all, you have to put the totality of circumstance together. I'm not there to be in the room with the investigators to determine, but I'm just going off of what knowledge we have and that's been given to us that's available. And what Tyler Cox is saying, and I'm taking him at his word, he's saying that there's no indication that they've cooperated. The lawyers that represent the family is saying we're prepared, but they did not say that they've cooperated whatsoever. So I'm looking at the statements that are produced, and all of the statements indicate that there has not been a cooperation with the phone being extracted from investigators. Therefore, there is no true determination that things were missing from the phone.
Now, the phone. Every case like this eventually produces one object that becomes a stand-in for the entire investigation. The single thing everyone agrees matters, even when they disagree about everything else surrounding it. In this case, that object is a phone. Not because it's guaranteed to contain the answer to what happened to Nolan Wells, but because it's the one piece of physical evidence both sides publicly agreed weeks ago to examine together, and it's the one piece of physical evidence that, as of this recording, still has not been jointly examined at all. Here is what is confirmed from multiple named sources about how Nolan's phone physically moved after he was reported missing. According to accounts from the friends who were on the boat that day, when the group arrived at Horn Island, most people, including Nolan, left their phones on the boat's dashboard rather than carrying them into the water, because saltwater exposure and a near total lack of cell service on the island make that a fairly standard practice for a day trip like this one. One of the friends, Warren, who owns a boat involved in the bilge pump incident, has stated publicly that at least 5 other people, not just Nolan, left their phones behind on the same trip, including a friend named Javon Williams, and that all those phones were returned to their owners without incident once everyone made it back to shore. Nolan's phone traveled back to the mainland with the group. Christine Wonsley has said the family used a location tracking app like 360 to locate the phone that evening and found it at the home of one of Nolan's friends. Warren has said publicly and repeated in a recorded interview that he personally told Christine Wonsley in the first phone call he ever had with her that the group had Nolan's phone and that there was never any attempt to hide that fact or delay handing it over. According to that same account, family and friends of the Wonsleys arrived later that night to retrieve the phone, and a separate, more tense encounter followed hours later when Nolan's father came looking for his son's car keys, which were eventually located inside the home. Warren's account states that both the phone and the keys were handed over the same night, without what he characterized as any real delay or confrontation over the items themselves. though he acknowledges the atmosphere around those visits was tense and, at one point that night, involved a call to local police to ask a group of visitors to leave the property. Here is the disputed part. Christine Wonsley has said publicly that once she and her sister went through the phone, specifically 2 Snapchat accounts, they found nothing, no saved pictures, no snaps from that day. And she has said this struck her as deeply unusual because by every account, including from Nolan's own friends, he was constantly taking pictures and videos at gatherings, to the point where family members expected of him. That is the detail we asked you to hold on to earlier in this video. And here's exactly where it lands. A mother who says her son documented everything found a phone with nothing documented from the one day it mattered most. The friend side of this has a competing explanation, and it deserves to be laid out with equal weight rather than dismissed. Multiple friends have said publicly that self-service on Horn Island is close to non-existent, that even sending a single picture message from the island to someone on the mainland routinely fails, and that most attendees simply do not bother trying to post to social media while they're out there, because the app returns an error rather than actually sending. One friend told ABC News that this is simply normal behavior for that specific location, not evidence of anything having been deleted. Under this explanation, there is nothing missing from the phone at all, because there was nothing there to begin with. Nolan, according to this account, never successfully posted anything that day, the same as everyone else on the island. Both of those explanations are logically coherent, taken entirely on their own terms. They cannot both be fully true and also explain everything, because Christine Wonsley's claim is specifically that the account showed no saved content, not just no posted content, and a saved but unposted photo does not require self-service to exist, only to be shared. That distinction, save versus sent, is exactly the kind of detail that a full forensic extraction of the device is built to resolve. And it is exactly the detail that has not yet been resolved, because as of this recording, no such extraction has taken place with both sides present. That brings us to the agreement everyone says they made, and to why, weeks later, nobody agrees on whether it's actually happening. At a press conference following a meeting between the Wonsley family and Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath, Ben Crump announced what he described as a mutual inspection. Both the state's investigators and the family's own forensic experts, working alongside attorney Eric Hertz and former law enforcement personnel brought on to the family's independent investigation, would examine the contents of Nolan's phone simultaneously, in the same room at the same time, so that no party could claim afterward that data had been altered, hidden, or selectively shared. Crump described this as standard legal practice, comparing it to how investigators examine a vehicle after a serious accident, everyone present for a single, shared extraction rather than the device changing hands multiple times. That announcement is confirmed. It happened. Reporters were there. It is on video. What remains disputed weeks later is whether that joint extraction has actually occurred, and if it hasn't, whose delay is responsible. Here is where the timeline gets genuinely contested. So we're going to walk through it carefully, one named source at a time, before you decide who you believe. Drop the word extraction in the comments once we get through this next section, because by the end of it, you're going to have a much clearer sense of exactly what has and has not happened to that phone. And we want to know if the timeline changed your read on this the way it changed ours. Attorney Tyler Cox, who represents several of the young men who were with Nolan that day, appeared on Attorney Dan Abrams' Sirius XM program and made a direct claim. Asked about a headline stating the family had agreed to give the sheriff's office access to Nolan's phone, Cox said he'd never heard that follow-through actually happened, and stated plainly that he believed the family had not turned the phone over to law enforcement. His exact framing was that the boys he represents had no reason to do anything to Nolan's phone other than hand it back the same night, and that any claim about missing text messages or wiped Snapchat data was, in his words, completely false. That interview aired, and within roughly a day, a letter surfaced from the family's local counsel, the firm A.R. Smith Law, addressed the boys' legal team and pushing back directly on the framing that had just aired. The letter states that the family's position has not changed, that they remain ready and willing to coordinate a joint forensic examination, that they had already discussed conducting that examination through the digital forensics lab at Mississippi Gulf Coast Community College, and that they had also discussed the possibility of FBI involvement in the process. The letter explicitly states that any suggestion the family has been uncooperative or has failed to cooperate with the investigation is not accurate, and asks the boys' legal team to provide available dates for the examination to move forward. That letter is confirmed to exist. It was read on air in full by Don Lemon during a broadcast covering this exact dispute. What it proves and what it does not prove are two different things, and this is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. The letter demonstrates that the family's attorneys, as of that date, were stating in writing that they remain willing to schedule the joint extraction. It does not, on its own, prove that the extraction has actually taken place, or establish a specific date on which it did. Prepare to cooperate and have cooperated are not identical claims, and the gap between those two phrases is precisely where this entire dispute has been living for weeks. Officer Brandon Tatum, the former Tucson police officer turned YouTube commentator who has conducted multiple interviews with a friend group, has repeatedly emphasized that gap. Appearing on Nancy Grace's program, Tatum stated that from his understanding, authorities do not currently have a phone, and that the family has not been cooperating with authorities to hand it over. He pointed to the language in the family's own statements, specifically the phrase, prepare to cooperate, as it's self-evident that as of the date those words were written, the phone had still not changed hands into law enforcement custody. Tatum has also stated that the young men he interviewed voluntarily handed their own phones over to the FBI for forensic examination without a warrant, and he has repeatedly framed that voluntary handover as standing in contrast to what he characterizes as the family's slower pace with Nolan's device. Nancy Grace pushed back on that framing in real time during the same broadcast, and it's worth walking through exactly how, because it clarifies what is actually known versus inferred. She noted that prepare to cooperate is, strictly read, not the same statement as have refused to cooperate, and pressed Tatum on whether he had any independent confirmation, beyond his own extrapolation from that phrase, that the family had actually declined a direct request from law enforcement. Tatum's answer was that he would draw his conclusion from the totality of available public statements, including Cox's on-air claim, and the family's own carefully worded letter, rather than from any confirmed refusal on record. That is an important distinction. As of this recording, there is no public statement from Sheriff Ledbetter's office or from District Attorney McElrath's office stating that they issued a specific request or subpoena for phone and that the family declined it. What exists on the public record is a family attorney saying they remain willing, a boy's attorney saying he doesn't believe that willingness has translated into an actual handover, and a commentator building an inference from the space between those two statements. A separate commentary channel pushed back even harder on Tatum's framing, in a video responding directly to his coverage, making an argument worth including here, because it exposes a real logical tension in how this story has been covered. That creator's argument runs as follows. If investigators genuinely believe Nolan's phone contained material evidence necessary to complete an active criminal investigation, standard procedure would be to formally request it, or, failing a voluntary handover, to seek a warrant compelling its production. As of this recording, no warrant for the phone has been reported, and no public statement from the sheriff's office describes a formal request having been made and refused. Under that reading, the absence of a warrant is itself information, either indicating investigators do not currently view the phone as essential to an active criminal case, or indicating that the process described in the family's own letter, a scheduled joint extraction rather than unilateral seizure, is simply still working its way toward a date. That same commentator also raised a separate point worth noting for context. Photographic evidence circulating publicly appears to show alcohol being provided to underage attendees on Horn Island that day, a potential legal issue in its own right that, as of this recording, has not resulted in any publicly reported arrests, which the creator argues undercuts the idea that every possible legal thread in this case is currently being pursued with equal urgency. It's also worth being transparent about how Officer Tatum came to have this level of access to the friend group in the first place. since that access is par-wise framing of this dispute has carried as much public weight as it has. That same rebuttal creator has pointed out that Tatum's ability to sit down with these young men and their families appears to trace back to a prior connection through Turning Point USA and related organizing circles, rather than to the kind of independent, from scratch sourcing a beat reporter with no prior relationship to either party would typically need to build. That existing relationship does not, on its own, make anything Tatum has reported inaccurate, and everything the friends told him in that interview was said openly, on camera, under their own names, available for anyone to review directly rather than taken on faith. But it is a relevant piece of context for weighing why Tatum secured the specific access when other outlets, including Ben Crump's own team, have said they reached out and were declined, and it is exactly the kind of source relationship disclosure our own reporting standard requires us to include rather than leave implicit. We are not going to tell you which interpretation is correct, because as of this recording, nobody outside the sheriff's office and the district attorney's office actually knows for certain whether a formal request of the phone was ever made. What we can tell you, confirmed and on the record from multiple named sources, is this. The joint extraction was announced publicly by Ben Crump following the family's meeting with the DA. Weeks later, the boy's attorney publicly stated he does not believe that extraction has occurred. The family's local counsel responded in writing, insisting their position of willingness has not changed. Neither side has produced a specific completed extraction date, and the sheriff's office, as of this recording, has not issued a public statement clarifying whether a formal legal request of the device was ever made and refused, or whether the process is simply proceeding on the scheduling timeline the family's letter described. We put a lot of research hours into laying that timeline out clearly for you, because most coverage of this case picks one side of that dispute and runs with it. If you'd rather get the version with every claim checked against a name and a date, that's what this channel does every single time, and it's genuinely the reason our subscriber numbers keep lagging behind our view counts. If you want the next update the moment either side produces an actual extraction date, now is a good moment to hit that subscribe button, because when that date surfaces, we're going to be one of the first channels to break down what it actually shows. Let's go deeper into the forensic side of this dispute, because there's a technical question underneath all of it that almost nobody covering this case has actually explained correctly, and it changes how urgent the physical phone even is. On Nancy Grace's program, digital forensics expert Heather Barnhart, who works with Celebrite and has been credited with helping crack other high-profile digital evidence cases, was brought in specifically to answer this question. Her point was direct and important. If Nolan's phone was syncing to iCloud or similar cloud services, meaningful data can exist independently of the physical device, and investigators do not necessarily need to hold the phone in hand to begin recovering some of it. However, she was equally clear that certain critical information, specifically the underlying system databases that reveal whether and when content was deleted, only exists on the physical device itself. Cloud backups can show what currently exists in the cloud. They cannot, on their own, reliably reconstruct a complete deletion history the way a full file system extraction of the actual phone can. Her recommendation was straightforward. Ideally, investigators need both the cloud data and the physical device to build a complete and legally defensible picture of what happened to that account. That distinction, cloud versus device, sounds technical, but it is genuinely the single most important piece of context in this entire dispute, because it means the physical phone stopped being the only thing capable of answering this question the moment investigators or the family's own experts got involved with any urgency. It matters enormously for how you should read every claim in this case about deleted content. Christine Wonsley's claim that the Snapchat account showed nothing is a claim about what she personally observed on a device before any professional forensic extraction took place. It is not, on its own, proof of deletion, because it's also consistent with content simply never having been saved or successfully sent in the first place, exactly as the friends have argued.
All I
We
can
have
tell
nothing
from that
else to
statement
go
is
off
we're
of.
prepared to cooperate. For all I know, that means We'll come in for questioning. We'll let you search his belongings. It
Nancy,
can mean
it's been
anything. That does not equal we have not handed over the phone. But hey, you know what?
Nancy. It's been weeks.
You say
they're
tomato,
prepared to
I say
cooperate.
tomato, because it kind of doesn't matter, and I'll tell you why it doesn't matter. Actually, I'll let an expert tell us why it doesn't matter. To Heather Barnhart joining us, digital forensics expert with Celebrite. We learned all about Celebrite during the Alex Murdaugh trial. That's how we got everything off of his dead, murdered son's phone. And the SANS Institute, SANS. She is one of the preeminent digital forensic experts in the country. She helped crack the Brian Kohberger case, and she is co-author of Practical Mobile Forensics, now in its 4th edition. That means that many people have used it. Heather, thank you for being with us. If the phone,
Thank you for having me.
I don't care where it is. Okay, actually, I do care where it is. I want to know that it's been handed over. I don't have to have the phone to know what's on the phone if it's in the cloud. It looks like an iPhone to me. So my argument with Officer Tatum is academic. It doesn't matter if I can get it from the cloud. So Nolan's phone missing. So what? I can download it. I can get it.
Data will exist in the cloud if he's syncing to iCloud and third-party applications. However, having physical access to the phone is where the databases exist that will have the truth on deletion. So you really need to get a full file system extraction of his phone as quickly as possible. So if it's not handed over to authorities now, it needs to be, because this was over a month ago now.
Do you have to have the phone to do the extraction? What about the cloud?
Cloud data is different, and there's a lot of information there. There could be unique information in the cloud that's been removed from the phone, if anything was removed, but it's best to have both cloud and the phone to paint the entire pattern of behavior and to see the truth.
Heather Barnhart, please don't move. Back to Officer Tatum joining us. Tatum, obviously, we want the phone. I think you can download it from the cloud, but she's the expert. She's saying it would help to have the phone. So don't you understand why? And I'm not saying this is true. I don't know that it's true. I don't know that CETO call is real or fake. I don't know. It's murky. You know, Tatum, when I would try cases, especially complicated cases, I would start out the trial with a big jar full of water and silt. And I had it sitting big on my counsel table day one, right beside my Bible. And in closing arguments, the first thing I would do when I started closing arguments, I'd take that jar and shake it. And it would get very murky. You couldn't see anything. And I'd sit it down on my counsel table and argument would commence. And by the time I had gone through all the evidence, I'd go over to my table, pick it up and say, see, it's not muddy anymore. It's crystal clear what happened. My point is, we don't know. So all the haters attacking you, attacking me, attacking the cops, attacking the friends, attacking Nolan's mother, for Pete's sake, we don't know. It's unjustified. Now, to my question. Don't you understand why people are suspicious? Because Nolan's separated from his phone, which no teen does. I get it, why he didn't have it in the water. I get that. I dive, I swim. I just went swimming with the dolphins with my twins. And yes, my phone was on the boat. But then I got it. I didn't let the boat take off without it. So at least you can admit that's why people are curious. I'm curious.
Nancy, I think it's because people are out putting out misinformation and they don't have the totality of circumstances because they haven't heard from the boys, didn't watch the interview and all of this stuff, and they feel that it's convoluted. It's very straightforward to me and very clear in many areas that the boys are saying they did not have access. Christine, Nolan's mother, is not saying unequivocally that things were deleted. She was surprised that things were not present. Therefore, she insinuated that things may have been deleted. But she did not really say that the phone was deleted. And the fact that they did not communicate with both sides, meaning that I wish that the Nolan Wells family would have communicated with these boys instead of me, would have talked to their lawyers instead of me, then therefore they could have gotten a good perspective. The boys made mention in the interview that I did with them that they told Christine, Nolan's mother, that they had his phone and his keys in their possession. Therefore, she came to get them. They turned them over. They have no access to his codes. They have no reason to delete his phone. They're claiming there's nothing that was deleted. They gave a fair explanation as to why he left the phone on the boat. Nolan wasn't the only individual to leave the phone on the boat. He wasn't the only black person to leave the phone on the boat. So that, to me, dispels the racial component. He was with them. Multiple boats came out. Traditionally, if you don't leave on a boat you came on, you can leave on another boat. They're all going to the same location. So it's not that bizarre that he left his phone. The phone was returned to Nolan. These are best friends of Nolan. They hang out almost every day.
Hold on just a sec.
He spent the night over their house.
I appreciate everything you're saying, but now we're getting to another topic. I hear you, but Tatum, the boat. Has the boat been searched by cadaver dogs and scent dogs?
The boat, from my understanding, has not been searched, and the cadaver dogs were made available for Benjamin Crump to utilize them to do a search on the boat. They refused.
No. Crump is not supposed to use the dogs.
There is no reason to search
everything on Crump.
Listen, Nancy, there's no reason if there's not any evidence of a murder, there's no reason for them to use the cadaver dog. That's how this works.
True.
There's none of these individuals they do not have any expectation that there was any murder that occurred. It's just other people are putting that out to the world. The police department is not investigating the murder. These boys are not suspects.
I agree they're not suspects. They're not persons of interest. They're not suspects. They haven't been charged. But
to believe after interviewing 60 people that he was ever on the boat.
The search of the Triton,
He's not
ordering
it. He's not ordering it. The cadaver dogs were made available if he wanted to. No. They availed themselves to him and said, would you like us to search the boat for you?
You just said that about Nolan Wells' mom. Now you said, I almost hate to do this to you. Almost. Tatum, you just said when Crump says we're available and ready, you meant, well, that's no, they haven't handed over the boat. But now you're saying the friends say our boat's available and ready, and I'm not going to tear you a new one because the law enforcement is the one that needs to go and search the boat.
Nancy,
it ain't rocket science.
The people who had questions about this, because it's definitely not law enforcement, it was Benjamin Crump. They wanted to get to the bottom. They don't trust law enforcement.
There's not a grand jury? This isn't going to grand jury?
I'm saying initially before grand jury.
Because if it's going to grand jury, then there are questions.
Initially before grand jury, when this first started, and Benjamin Crump brought up all of these questions, and they availed themselves to him and said, would you like for us to search the boat? We'll grant the cadaver dogs for you to go and look at the boat. And he refused. And this is why I'm saying it does not appear.
Give authority to search the boat.
The boys are cooperating.
I want you to run over to Tatum's house and sniff the hell out of it. Because
I would say,
house.
come on over. I would say, no. I said, come on over. The cadaver dogs are made available. But then Benjamin Crump said, well, we don't want it. That's the problem here.
Wait a minute.
They are not pursuing like they claim they are.
Say, here's our boat. Come search it. Did the families offer the boat up to search?
They offered boat, phones, whatever investigators needed, whatever the family needed, they made it available. The family did not pursue any avenue to connect with the boys on any level. The boat, to talk about timeline, to communicate with parents, to communicate with lawyers, they have done nothing. And then now we find out that they haven't even given the phone over to law enforcement so they can do an extraction or a forensic investigation.
Well, stop.
That they can see.
You know what? I respect you, but I'm going to have to cut your mic because we have to be clear about something. Hold on.
Only a proper forensic extraction, ideally involving both cloud records and the physical device together, with both sides present the way Ben Crump originally described, can actually settle which explanation is correct. Until that happens, both it was deleted and there was nothing there to begin with remain claims, not established facts, no matter how confidently either side states them. There's a second, quieter forensic point worth adding here, because it bears directly on how much weight either side of this phone dispute deserves right now. Parental technology advisor Tanya Jordan, also appearing on that same broadcast, explained how Snapchat's own retention system actually works in practice, a detail that most casual coverage of this case has gotten wrong in one direction or the other. If a photo or video is sent through the app, but the recipient has not yet opened it, that content can sit live on Snapchat's own server for up to 30 days before it expires, meaning it is not necessarily gone the moment someone believes they have deleted it. The same holds true for unread text messages more broadly. Jordan's point was that if law enforcement submits a valid legal request to a platform like Snapchat before the underlying content actually expires or is permanently deleted, that data can often still be recovered directly from a platform, independent of whatever the physical device shows. If, however, message or snap has already fully expired or been deleted before any such request goes out, recovery becomes considerably harder and, in some cases, impossible even for the platform itself. That single detail is the clearest technical argument in this entire case for why time, not just possession of the phone, matters. Every week that passes without a completed joint extraction is a week in which any recoverable server-side data, if it ever existed, has a greater chance of aging past the point where it can still be pulled. That same broadcast waded into a related and, frankly, murkier argument over polygraphs. Tatum stated that all but one of the young men he interviewed had voluntarily taken what he described as a polygraph test and passed, without lawyers present, and cooperated fully with investigators in doing so. Pressed on this by Nancy Grace, Tatum clarified that what actually occurred was computer voice stress analysis, not a traditional polygraph, a distinction he characterized as a difference in methodology aimed at the same underlying goal of detecting deception. Death investigator Joe Scott Morgan and defense attorney Philip DeBette, both also on that panel, clarified that neither a polygraph nor a voice stress analysis is admissible in a criminal trial in most circumstances, unless both prosecution and defense specifically stipulate in advance to allow it, which almost never happens. In other words, whatever these young men did or didn't take, and whatever it did or didn't show, none of it currently carries legal weight in the way the word polygraph tends to imply to a general audience. It may speak to their own confidence in their account. It does not function as courtroom-grade proof of anything. This is also where we have to be honest about a broader credibility problem that has followed Officer Tatum's coverage of this specific case, because it directly affects how much weight to give some of his claims about the phone. A separate commentary channel, responding point by point to several of Tatum's videos, has argued that Tatum has shifted his own public position on this case more than once depending on which way public sentiment was moving at a given moment. That creator pointed to an earlier broadcast in which Tatum, addressing a private message reportedly sent to someone connected to a friend group describing an argument involving Nolan shortly before his disappearance, stated on camera that he personally did not believe Nolan simply drowned on his own, and suggested he believed someone likely knew more about Nolan's final hours than had been made public. Weeks later, in the exchange with Nancy Grace covered earlier in this video, Tatum's position had shifted toward emphasizing that this does not currently appear to be an active criminal investigation at all, based on the sheriff's public statements. The rebuttal creator's argument is that those two positions sit in real tension with each other. If Tatum genuinely believes foul play remains a live possibility, treating the case as merely a drowning investigation when convenient, and treating it as a likely cover-up when convenient, undercuts the credibility of either claim. We are including that criticism here because it is a real, publicly made argument about a source's video as quoted extensively, and because our own editorial standard requires us to flag inconsistency in a source's own public claims just as carefully as we flag inconsistency between competing sources. One more piece of that same broadcast deserves inclusion because it's been misrepresented in both directions online. Tatum stated that cadaver dogs were, in his understanding, made available to Ben Crump's team to search Warren's boat, and that this offer was declined. Nancy Grace pushed back hard on the legal framing here, and her pushback is worth including because it's simply accurate as a matter of process. A private citizen, including an attorney representing a grieving family, does not have the legal authority to compel a search of someone else's private property, including a boat, using cadaver dogs, or otherwise. That authority rests with law enforcement. If cadaver dogs were genuinely made available and the family's team chose not to use them, that is a fact worth knowing. It is not, on its own, evidence that no search is warranted or that nothing happened on that boat, because it was never within Ben Crump's legal power to unilaterally initiate that search in the first place, only to request that law enforcement do so. As of this recording, there is no public confirmation from Sheriff Ledbetter's office that the boat has been formally searched by law enforcement using cadaver dogs, scent dogs, or any other forensic method. So where does that leave the phone dispute? As cleanly as we can state it. Confirmed. A joint forensic extraction was announced publicly by Ben Crump following a meeting with the district attorney. Confirmed. The boy's attorney has publicly stated weeks later that he does not believe that extraction has occurred and that the phone remains outside law enforcement custody. Confirmed. The family's local counsel responded in writing reaffirming their stated willingness to proceed. Disputed whether the delay, if there is one, originates on the family side, from scheduling logistics between multiple parties and institutions, or from something else entirely. Unknown, as of this recording, whether the sheriff's office or district attorney's office ever issued a formal request or subpoena for the device that was declined, because neither office has made a public statement addressing that specific question directly. That gap, an unresolved factual question sitting at the center of a case with millions of viewers and multiple competing media narratives, is exactly the kind of thing that gets filled with speculation when nobody involved will simply say plainly what happened. And speculation is precisely what is flooded in. If you're still with us, drop the word cooperate in the comments, because that word has been used by nearly every person in this dispute to mean something slightly different, and we genuinely want to know if breaking apart this carefully changed how you're reading the whole fight. We're not asking you to pick a side. We're asking whether the timeline itself, laid out plainly, moved you at all. Before we move on, if this kind of detailed source-by-source breakdown is what keeps you coming back to this case, we genuinely appreciate you joining our subscriber community. Right now, a lot more of you are watching these updates than are actually subscribed, and every subscription tells us it's worth putting in the hours to keep tracking this one this carefully. Before we get to the Friend Zone account, it's worth turning the same scrutiny we just applied to the family side of the phone dispute back onto the investigation itself. Because the word cooperation has been used almost exclusively in this case to describe what the family and the friend group owe investigators. It has rarely been used the other way around, and the public record actually has quite a bit to say about that gap too. Under Mississippi law, crime victims' families are entitled to receive an initial incident report within 72 hours. At the family's meeting with District Attorney McElrath, Attorney Eric Hertz raised the specific statute directly and confirmed on the record in front of reporters that as of that meeting date, well past the 72-hour window, the family still had not received that report. Christine Wonsley herself told reporters at that same press conference that the last direct contact she had received from anyone at the sheriff's office before that meeting was a single text message, one she had sent herself, simply asking for an update, with no reply beyond an acknowledgement. It later emerged that the district attorney's office had quietly taken over primary communication with the family through a victim advocate, a reasonable administrative decision on its own, but one that nobody had actually explained Christine and Elmore Wonsley before that meeting, leaving them to interpret weeks of silence from the sheriff's office as something closer to abandonment than a simple handoff between agencies. District Attorney McElrath's office did commit, at that meeting, to improving that communication going forward, and Crump publicly credited her for taking accountability for the gap once it came up directly. But the underlying fact remains part of the record. For well over a week during an active death investigation into her own son, a mother's only contact with the agency investigating his death was a text message she had to send herself. There is a darker layer to the same theme worth including, because it complicates any narrative that treats scrutiny in this case as flowing in only one direction. Ben Crump has stated publicly that both Trayston Shepard and other members of the friend group have received actual death threats since coming forward to correct the viral video and photo claims, a genuinely serious escalation that this channel does not take lightly regardless of which side of any dispute someone falls on. Separately, Crump has stated that artificial intelligence-generated videos falsely depicting Christine Wonsley have circulated online while she has been simultaneously grieving and planning her son's funeral. Fabricated content built specifically to attack a mother in the middle of the worst period of her life. Neither of those facts resolves a single disputed question in this case, but both belong in any honest accounting of what cooperation and good faith have actually looked like from every direction here, because a case this large has produced real harm on more than one side of the dispute, to people who did not ask to become public figures, and it is worth naming that plainly before moving forward rather than letting it sit as an unspoken backdrop. Let's turn to the friend group's own account of that day, because in a case this contested, it matters to hear directly from the people at the center of the online scrutiny, in their own words, rather than only through commentators arguing about them secondhand. 3 of Nolan's close friends, Warren, Jackson, and Morgan, sat for an extended, unedited interview specifically to address what they described as a wave of misinformation about their relationship with Nolan and their conduct that day. A few things from that interview are worth walking through carefully, because they add texture that gets lost when the story is compressed into a headline. On the question of whether they were genuinely close to Nolan, all 3 pushed back forcefully against online claims that they were, in their words, fake friends. They described him as the emotional center of their friend group, someone who almost never got visibly angry, and who acted as an informal peacemaker whenever conflict flared between people in their circle. They described a friendship that predated high school, going back to middle school for at least one of them, and said Nolan regularly stayed overnight at their houses, to the point where one friend's father and Nolan reportedly had what he called their own private friendship, watching movies together while the rest of the group did something else entirely in the backyard. They pushed back specifically on the idea that not knowing each other's parents well would somehow prove a friendship wasn't real, noting that grown teenagers commonly have close friends whose parents they've never formally met, without that undermining the closeness of the relationship itself. On the question of Horn Island itself, the friends described the specific trip as nothing unusual, a continuation of a yearly 4th of July tradition their group had shared for years, and noted they had already been to the island multiple times that same year, weeks before the 4th of July, with Nolan present each time. They specifically argued that if there had been any intent to harm Nolan, choosing to do so during the single most crowded, most photographed day of the year on that island, surrounded by hundreds of boats and witnesses, would make little practical sense. On the boat malfunction itself, Warren, who owns the vessel, gave a detailed technical explanation. He described the bilge, the lowest compartment of the boat containing the batteries and electronics, filling with water after an automatic pump failed to activate. He described unscrewing an access cap and watching water begin overflowing onto the deck, at which point the group moved into what he called full panic mode. Working towed the boat out while the electronics were, in his words, completely fried by the water. He described the operator eventually getting the motor's trim system working manually, allowing the boat to get up on plane, at which point the forward suction of the water rushing past the hull pulled the accumulated water back out through the open bilge plug, a standard emergency technique among experienced boaters. According to this account, the viral video showing the boat being towed and someone yelling captures exactly this moment. The emergency call to a private towing service, not any confrontation involving Nolan, who by this account was already off the boat and on the island by that point. On the specific moment the group left the island, the friends described a boater named Wyatt urging Nolan repeatedly to get back on the boat as the water emergency unfolded, with Nolan declining because he wanted to stay with a young woman he had been talking to that day and telling the group he had another ride arranged. According to this account, that is a common and unremarkable thing to do at Horn Island specifically, where the boating community is described by multiple friends as close-knit enough that finding an alternate ride back to mainland, even from someone you don't personally know, is considered close to guaranteed. One friend described a separate, unrelated incident that same holiday in which another intoxicated attendee, unable to locate his own boat, asked a stranger for a ride, was brought aboard, and had his parents contacted, all without major incident, as an example of how that culture of informal cooperation functions on the island. On the viral photograph showing Nolan and friends together on the boat, the friends explained that it was not taken on a phone at all, but on a small physical camera one of the young women on the trip had brought along, and that it was taken specifically because Nolan spotted the camera on the dashboard and suggested taking a picture. That photo was later shared with Christine Wonsley by the young woman who took it at the family's own request, specifically to help identify what clothing Nolan had been wearing that day for the public search effort, not as any kind of attempted evidence or cover story, according to this account. On the phone and keys specifically, the account largely mirrors what we already walked through, with one addition. Warren has stated that on the night Nolan was reported missing, a group of roughly 10 to 15 people, some known to him from high school and some strangers, arrived at his home, some of it, by his account, confrontational in tone, demanding to know where Nolan's boat was located, and that the situation escalated enough that his brother eventually called local police to have the group removed from the property around 2 a.m. He maintains this occurred after he had already voluntarily disclosed Christine Wonsley, in their very first phone call, that the group had Nolan's phone in their possession. Nolan's father reportedly returned separately, hours later, in a calmer exchange, specifically to retrieve his son's keys, which were eventually located inside the home and handed over without significant delay, according to this account. On cooperation with law enforcement more broadly, all three friends stated they voluntarily gave formal statements to investigators within days of the search, that each interview ran well over an hour, and that all three willingly surrendered their personal phones to be forensically examined, which they say has already occurred through the FBI. One friend described telling his own account starting from the day before Nolan even disappeared, walking investigators through everything from what time he got off work to what the group had been discussing about that year's 4th of July trip weeks in advance, specifically so nothing would be left out that could later matter. Officer Tatum has repeated this specific point, that the friend group turned their own phones over voluntarily, several times across multiple broadcasts, generally in direct contrast to the unresolved status of Nolan's phone. It is worth noting that a voluntary phone handover from a witness and a joint forensic extraction of a victim's own device, agreed to by multiple parties across two separate institutions, are procedurally different processes with different logistical requirements, which may partly explain why one moved faster than the other, even setting aside any question of intent on either side. The toxicology question sitting underneath all of this deserves one more mention before we move on, because it connects several threads we've already covered. Multiple friends have acknowledged the group had been drinking on Horn Island that day, a detail Tracy Shepard volunteered publicly and without being pressed on it, alongside imagery that has circulated showing alcohol being provided to attendees who appear to be under Mississippi's legal drinking age. Legal analyst Tyler Bailey has noted that if Nolan himself had alcohol in his system, that fact alone could meaningfully affect how a medical examiner interprets a drowning in open water, since intoxication measurably impairs swimming ability and reaction time, which is part why the still pending toxicology results carry as much weight in this case as the phone dispute itself, even though far less public attention has been paid to them. On the question of race, which has become one of the most heavily debated dimensions of this entire case online, the friends directly addressed accusations that their friendship with Nolan, or their conduct that day, was in any way influenced by his race. They stated plainly that they consider that framing false and painful, pointed to years of shared vacations, proms, and homecomings documented across each other's social media as evidence of a genuine, long-standing friendship, and said the accusation has made an already devastating loss significantly harder to carry, particularly because they say it has cost them the ability to attend their friend's own funeral out of concern for their physical safety and out of a desire not to draw attention away from Nolan on what they described as his day. We want to pause here and be very clear about something, because this is exactly the kind of moment where a channel with looser sourcing standards starts making things worse rather than better. As of this recording, Sheriff John Ledbetter has stated publicly that there is no information indicating a crime occurred, and none of these young men have been named as suspects or persons of interest by any law enforcement agency involved in this investigation. Everything you just heard is their own account, given voluntarily on camera under their own names, and it should be weighed as exactly that, a first-person account from people who have not been charged with anything, alongside every other account in this case, including the families, rather than treated as either confirmed fact or as a confession dressed up as an explanation. Our editorial standard on this channel does not change based on how loud a claim is online, and it is not going to change here either. If any part of that interview shifted how you're weighing this case, even slightly, drop the word dashboard in the comments, tied to the detail about where the phones were left that day, because that single small choice, leaving devices on a boat dashboard rather than carrying them into the water, has turned into one of the most argued over facts in the entire investigation. And we're curious how many of you had actually heard both sides of that particular explanation before today.
Philip Dubé joining me. He is a veteran trial lawyer, a defense lawyer. He's joining me out of L.A. He practices criminal and constitutional law. Dubé, I don't want to hear either a prosecution or a defense side. A citizen cannot force a search on somebody else's boat. So Crump or Mrs. or Nolan's mother, they cannot force a cadaver dog or a scent dog search on the Triton. Law enforcement needs to bring out a cadaver dog and a scent dog. It's just real simple. It's not hard. Do you agree? They are the ones with authority to do that.
Of course. A lot of these thought leaders and crusaders, the thought leaders and the crusaders can all request it and make sure that there's an in-depth, thorough investigation, but they cannot physically and personally initiate it or enforce all the procedures that are necessary to get that underway. One thing they can do, though, is go to the DA's office and ask that it be included as part of the grand jury investigation. Because believe me, Nancy, a grand jury starts investigating and wants all of these materials, including access to the boat, access to the cell phone, it's going to happen. Otherwise, they will suffer the pains of contempt of the grand jury.
Dubé, my point is, Crump, nor Nolan's mother, nor anybody on their team can issue a subpoena or a directive or give permission for somebody else's boat to be searched. So when that was put to Crump, he doesn't have the authority to do that. He's a lawyer. He knows that. And it's not the friend's prerogative either. It's law enforcement needs to go do it.
Correct.
I can't come search your home. That would be trespass.
Correct.
Law enforcement has to do it. That's a yes, no. I don't need a legal discourse. Yes or no?
Yes.
Back to Officer Brandon Tatum. He's the star of The Officer Tatum on YouTube. So, Officer Tatum, let me understand. I don't know, and I don't think you know, where Nolan Wells' phone is. The family may have it, or it may have been seized or handed over to law enforcement. And if it hasn't, then they, law enforcement, need to issue a warrant for it. It's really not hard. You've executed warrants before, I'm sure. So have I.
Well, you're going to have a reason to get a warrant. And if it's a criminal investigation and they believe that they can find evidence of a crime, if they had access to his phone, I could see them getting a warrant to extract his phone outside of the parent's will. But if you're looking at a potential drowning and there's no criminal element involved, and the parents are refusing to give over the phone, they don't believe it's any material evidence there. No, I'm saying this is what the law enforcement agency.
These questions anymore.
Nancy,
I'm
this is what the law enforcement. I'm giving you a law enforcement perspective.
Nobody said Nolan. You know what? We're really chasing our tails here. We don't know that Nolan's family has refused to hand over the phone. My simple question to you is, law enforcement, if they want the phone, get a warrant for the phone. Go get the
They may
phone.
not
Or
Nancy, they don't
communicate
want
to the
phone.
family, give me the phone.
Nancy, there could be two things afoot. I'm not a part of the investigation, but I can see if they haven't gotten the phone yet, it's because they don't need the phone and they don't want the phone. It's not there of evidentiary value if there is no suspect here. If it was a drowning and there's indications of a drowning, they may not need it, Nancy, so they're not going to go get it. If they need it, they would have already had it a month ago.
Stop. Okay. Brandon Tatum, are you a medical examiner?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Because what I have been told, and correct me if I'm wrong, don't smile at me. It's not working.
I'm trying.
From what I understand, let's go to the expert. Joe Scott Morgan is joining me, Joseph Scott Morgan, Professor of Forensics, Jacksonville State University, world-class criminal program, author of Blood Beneath My Feet on YouTube, star of a hit series, Body Bags with Joe Scott Morgan, death investigator, over 10,000 death investigations under his belt. Joe Scott, it's my understanding, correct me if you know differently, or Susan Hendricks, Dave Mack, jump in, please, feet first. Both medical examiners have stated to the effect, one says, undetermined now, because we're waiting on, I think, toxicology. We don't know the answer. The second one has said, undetermined cause of death. That's a yes, no. Isn't that true? We don't have a cause of death yet.
That has been made public. No. They said last week.
So
Hang on.
Tatum,
They said last week. They said last week that the autopsy report is complete, which means they have tox, histo, and they've probably got a cause of death.
Okay, but we don't have the cause of death.
We don't. It has not been released yet.
And the second examiner said undetermined.
Yeah, because he didn't have any organs to examine.
Exactly. Officer Tatum, you keep saying it was a drowning. I have responded, are you a medical examiner? You said no. So, how do you know what happened other than what you've been told? I don't know what happened. I don't know if he was hit on the head. I don't know if he got drunk and drowned. I don't know. So how do you know?
Nancy, I have to push back on you on this. I did not say it was a drowning. I gave you two options. I said the police could be investigating a crime, and if they're investigating a crime and they have suspects and they need evidence, they will extract the phone with a search warrant against the family's will. If they do not believe that they're investigating a crime that's been committed and it is a drowning, according to them, they may not need the phone. So they're not gonna do a warrant to extract the phone against the family's will. So that's all I'm saying, Nancy. I did not say I know for a fact whichever way it went. I really don't know, and nobody knows except for the people that are investigating.
I heard you.
No, I just made mention that they may be investigating it as a drowning. The initial findings, or at least the initial report that came out. Are you going to make mommy
do a playback? Am I going to have to do a playback?
Nancy, I did not say that it was a drowning. I said that they could have investigated as a drowning or as a suspect involved in a murder, and that's why they would do certain things and not do others.
My point is, Tatum, we don't know the answer, and this is an investigation to find out what happened. And when you have an investigation, you subpoena documents, items, testimony. There's a grand jury set. That means there is an investigation. You know what a grand jury is, right? They investigate. They have two tasks. One, as an investigation arm. Two, as a charging arm. In both cases, they gather evidence. If they find out this was an accidental drowning, so be it. If they find out he had help getting drowned, so be it. Our point here, and with this, I think you agree, is not to harm anyone's reputation, bury somebody unwarrantedly, name the wrong person. I'm not naming anybody. I want to know what happened to Nolan. I don't understand why so many people are upset about that. And speaking of drowning, I'm actually glad you brought that up, Tatum. To Joe Scott Morgan, death investigator, it could be that he did drown, but that does not rule out foul play. It doesn't rule it in. It doesn't rule it out. Explain.
Yeah, you're correct. I mean, drowning, just so you understand, if somebody, say for instance, has a head injury, right, and they fall into a body of water, all right, that can lead to drowning, right? Because they might still be unconscious but capable of breathing. And of course, if you're in a water environment, you're going to be taking on water. I've worked cases where water has actually been weaponized as a means to take someone's life. But I've also worked, Nancy, a lot of cases involving accidental drownings where people fall over the side of boats. I've even had homeless guys that have passed out face down in mud puddles and have drowned. You never can predict, how any of this is going to happen. All we can do in the morgue, the medical legal community, is assess what we see at that moment in time. When we're trying to look at the lungs, we're trying to look actually at the inner ear. That's one of the areas that we go to with drowning. And we try to assess the brain as well, because you can have the brain begin to swell in these certain circumstances. So there is a huge recipe that goes into this when you're trying to do a fatal diagnosis here. When you're trying to come up and make this assessment, you want to do it necessarily. I think it's best you try to do this independent of maybe what the police are saying, what friends are saying. You objectively look at the science of what's before you, and then after that, you go back in and factor in some of the circumstantial information.
Now, we have to address something that runs underneath almost every piece of coverage in this case, including several of the segments you've already heard clips from in this video, because pretending it isn't there would be its own kind of dishonesty. This case has become, for a significant portion of its online audience, a referendum on race in America, and the coverage has split sharply along those lines. Some commentators, including members of the Congressional Black Caucus who have publicly demanded a full federal investigation, have framed this case within a longer, well-documented history of black victims in the American South receiving less urgent scrutiny from local law enforcement than white victims do, and have pointed specifically to Sheriff Ledbetter's initial "no reason to believe a crime occurred" statement, issued before toxicology results were even available, as an example of exactly that pattern. Other commentators, including Officer Tatum, have pushed back forcefully on that framing specifically, arguing that applying presumption of racial motive to a group of individual young people, based primarily on a photograph showing Nolan as the only black attendee visible in that particular frame, risks doing real harm to people who have not been charged with any crime and may have played no role whatsoever in what happened to their friend. We're not going to tell you which of those broader arguments is correct, because that is a genuinely contested social and political question that reasonable, informed people disagree on, and it is not this channel's role to hand you a verdict on it. What we can tell you, factually, is that this dimension of the case is real. It has shaped press coverage on every side of this story, including several of the clips in this video, and it has materially affected how different parts of the public are receiving the exact same set of facts. A congressman who visited the family described the case, in his words, as impossible to separate from race, given the demographics visible in the widely circulated Horn Island photographs and the broader history of similar cases in Mississippi specifically. He drew a direct comparison to how differently he believes national cable news would have treated a case with an identical set of unresolved facts if the missing teenager had instead been a white girl from an affluent family, and argued that the uneven volume of coverage across different media outlets is itself a data point worth examining. A separate commentator on a different broadcast argued just as forcefully that treating an entire friend group as suspect based on a photograph, absent any actual evidence connecting any of them to a crime, is its own form of injustice, one that falls specifically on named, uncharged private citizens who happen to have been photographed with their friend on the worst day of his life. There is also a third position worth including here, because it complicates a debate that too often gets flattened into exactly two sides. Some black commentators covering this case have argued that the race conversation, however legitimate as a broader historical pattern, has at times pulled attention away from Nolan himself and toward an abstract argument about whether he should have been socialized with a majority white friend group in the first place, a framing that Nolan's own closest friends, including Javon Williams, have explicitly declined to endorse when asked directly on camera whether he believed race was a factor in what happened. Other commentators push back on that same framing from the opposite direction, arguing that raising uncomfortable historical patterns is not the same thing as assigning individual blame, and that a family's own stated experience navigating a Southern legal system carries real weight regardless of whether any specific allegation, in this case, is ultimately proven. Both of those positions and the tension between them have played out publicly, often between people who otherwise share a great deal of common ground, and that tension is itself part of the honest record of how this case has been discussed. Both of those positions exist in the public conversation around this case right now, held by real people speaking on the record, and we felt an obligation to tell you that plainly rather than pretend this case is being discussed in a vacuum. What we will not do on this channel is put an ominous tone underneath any uncharged person's name while presenting either argument, because as of this recording, nobody involved in this friend group has been charged with anything, and our own sourcing standard does not bend for engagement. Let's bring this back to where the actual investigation stands today, because underneath all the online argument, there's a real, ongoing legal process moving forward on its own timeline, and it deserves your attention as much as the phone dispute does. District Attorney Angel Myers-McElrath has confirmed to the family that this case will be presented to a grand jury once the sheriff's office concludes its investigation. Legal analysts covering this case have been consistent on one specific point worth repeating clearly, because it gets misunderstood constantly online. A grand jury referral in Jackson County is described by the district attorney's own office as standard procedure for any unnatural or suspicious death, and does not by itself mean criminal charges are imminent or even likely. It means a body of citizens will eventually review whatever evidence is presented to them and decide whether probable cause exists to support an indictment on some charge, which would range anywhere from a homicide-related offense to something considerably narrower, like evidence tampering or obstruction, or could result in no charges being recommended at all. As of this recording, no date for that grand jury proceeding has been publicly announced. It's worth being specific about what a grand jury in this case could actually be looking at, because most online commentary jumps straight to the most serious possible outcome and skips over everything in between. Civil rights attorney Tyler Bailey, speaking as an outside legal analyst on this case, has laid out the range clearly. A grand jury could examine text messages, or notably the absence of expected text messages, along with cell phone data, GPS records, and witness testimony under oath, and could ultimately weigh probable cause on any charge connected to Nolan's disappearance and death, not exclusively a homicide charge. That range includes possibilities like obstruction of justice or accessory after the fact if evidence emerged that someone had actively worked to conceal information from investigators, all the way down to no charges whatsoever, if the evidence ultimately supports the sheriff's original assessment of an accidental drowning. Bailey has also noted a genuinely difficult evidentiary reality specific to a body recovered from open water after several days. Forensic pathologists can face real difficulty distinguishing blunt force trauma sustained before death from postmortem injury caused by tidal movement, marine life, or the recovery process itself, which is part of why both the state and independent autopsies have taken as long as they have, and why toxicology results in particular carry real weight here, since intoxication can meaningfully affect a person's ability to swim or respond to an emergency in open water. Grand jury proceedings themselves are, by design, secretive. There is no media coverage inside the room. Defense attorneys are not present. Ben Crump will not be present. A single prosecutor presents whatever evidence has been gathered to a panel of citizens, typically somewhere between 15 and 25 people in Jackson County, who then decide independently whether probable cause exists. If that panel ultimately declines to recommend any charges, legal analysts have noted that questions will likely follow about whether the panel was given a complete picture of the evidence or a narrower one, and if charges are recommended. That outcome would tend to validate concerns that have been raised publicly throughout this case about the pace and thoroughness of the initial investigation. Either outcome will say something real about how this case was actually built, which is one more reason the completed phone extraction matters as much as it does. A grand jury cannot weigh evidence that was never actually collected. The state's official autopsy remains pending, with officials citing outstanding toxicology results as the primary delay. The family's independently commissioned autopsy, conducted in Washington, D.C., has also not yet had its findings released publicly, with Crump citing both logistical transport delays and the ordinary pace of thorough independent medical review. As of this recording, neither examination has produced a publicly confirmed cause or manner of death. Every claim you have heard anywhere online describing Nolan's official cause of death is settled, whether that claim describes an accidental drowning or something else entirely, is, as of this recording, ahead of the actual evidence. The GPS and dispatch audio records we referenced earlier in this video remain the most concrete, least disputed pieces of the public record, because they come from a state agency's own equipment and a private towing company's own call log, rather than from any single interested party's personal account. They confirm the boat's movements that day down to the minute. They do not, on their own, explain what happened to Nolan in the roughly 90-minute window between when he was last seen around 3 in the afternoon and when the boat, carrying his friends, finally cleared the island at 4:31. That window remains the single largest unexplained gap in this entire case, and neither the phone dispute, nor the viral photo, nor the viral video, nor any interview from any party involved has closed it. Katie, the young woman Nolan was reportedly speaking with in his final confirmed minutes on the island, has still not given a direct, on-the-record interview to any major outlet as of this recording. What the public has is an account relayed through her sister, Gracie McCormick, on social media, stating that Nolan told Katie he intended to head back toward the boat he originally arrived on, a detail that runs in direct tension with a friend group's account that Nolan told him he intended to stay behind. That contradiction between what Nolan reportedly told the last person he spoke with and what he reportedly told the friends leaving on the boat remains entirely unresolved, and it may end up being more central to understanding what actually happened that afternoon than anything involving the phone. It is also worth noting plainly that Katie is, by every account so far, a minor witness relayed almost entirely through her family rather than a primary source speaking for herself, and our own sourcing standard means we're not going to treat a second-hand account, however sincere, with the same evidentiary weight as an on-record statement from the person who actually lived it. Until Katie speaks for herself, if she ever does, that specific contradiction stays exactly where we've left it here. Real, documented, and unresolved. Here is what we can say with real confidence, sitting where we are right now. This case has two genuinely separate tracks running simultaneously. One track is a slow-moving, procedurally normal death investigation, working through toxicology results, grand jury scheduling, and evidence extraction that both sides say they still intend complete jointly. The other track is a fast-moving, emotionally charged public battle over which side is more trustworthy, fought out across YouTube channels, cable panels, and social media threads, often using evidence that has already been publicly corrected or walked back by the very people who first introduced it. Those two tracks are not moving at the same speed, and a significant amount of the confusion around this case comes from people mistaking developments on the second track for developments on the first. We told you at the start of this video that we would mark every claim as confirmed, disputed, or unknown. So let's finish with exactly that cleanly, so you leave with a clear picture rather than a stronger opinion. Confirmed, Nolan Wells disappeared from Horn Island on July 4th and was found deceased on July 6th. Confirmed, the boat carrying his friends left the island at 4:31 that afternoon following a bilge pump failure, according to GPS records from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources. Confirmed, a joint forensic extraction of Nolan's phone was publicly announced by Ben Crump following a meeting with the district attorney. Confirmed, the viral pool party photo was taken 8 days before Nolan's disappearance, according to metadata reported by Rolling Stone. Confirmed, the voice in a widely circulated video was later publicly identified as Trayston Shepard's, not Nolan's, by Shepard himself, and this has not been contradicted by Ben Crump's own subsequent statement. Confirmed, The case is expected to be presented to a grand jury once the sheriff's investigation concludes, and grand jury referrals are described as standard procedure for unnatural deaths in Jackson County. Disputed whether the joint phone extraction has actually taken place, with the boy's attorney publicly stating he does not believe it has, and the family's local counsel maintaining in writing that they remain willing and have not refused. Disputed whether Nolan told Katie he was heading back to the boat or told his friends he intended to stay behind. Two accounts that directly contradict each other and have not been reconciled. Disputed whether Christine Wonsley's discovery of empty Snapchat accounts reflects deleted content or simply content that was never successfully saved due to Horn Island's limited cell service. Unknown the official cause and manner of Nolan Wells' death, pending both the state and independent autopsy results. Unknown exactly what happened during the roughly 90-minute window between Nolan being last seen around 3 in the afternoon and his friend's boat departing the island. Unknown whether the sheriff's office or district attorney's office ever issued a formal, specific request for Nolan's phone that was declined, since neither office has addressed that particular question on the record. Unknown whether a grand jury will ultimately recommend any charges at all, and if so, against whom or for what. Unknown whether the roughly 50 to 100 daily tips reaching the family's independent investigation contain anything that meaningfully advances the case, since none of that material has been made public, and much of it, by the family's own admission, involves conflicting or unverified second-hand accounts. Unknown what, if anything, the joint phone extraction will actually show once it happens, since every claim about deleted content on either side remains, as of this recording, an assertion rather than a forensic finding. Nobody covering this case, on any channel, including this one, gets to skip past that discomfort by picking the version of events that feels most emotionally satisfying. It is worth naming plainly, one more time, what all that adds up to. This is not a case where one side has been caught lying and the other has been vindicated. It is a case where two separate camps have each produced their own version of receipts, a letter here, a voluntary phone handover there, a witness correction, a technical explanation of a boat malfunction, and where almost none of those receipts, examined individually and honestly, actually settles a specific question they were introduced to answer. That is an uncomfortable place to leave an audience that came here wanting a clean answer, and we're not going to pretend otherwise just to give you a tidier ending. There's one more number worth sitting with before we close this out, because it hints at just how much of this case still hasn't reached the public at all. Attorney Eric Hertz has stated that the family's independent investigation, running in parallel to the official one, has been receiving somewhere between 50 and 100 calls a day from people who say they were on Horn Island that day or who know someone who was. That is not a typo, and it is not a one-time surge. That is sustained daily volume of tips, week after week. And Hertz has specifically noted that some of those callers are reaching out to the family's independent team rather than to the sheriff's office directly, which raises its own uncomfortable question about how many witnesses, in this case, simply do not feel comfortable walking into a local sheriff's department to say what they saw. Sheriff Ledbetter's office has separately confirmed receiving a large volume of its own tips and has publicly asked anyone with unedited photos or video from the island that afternoon to come forward. Two separate tip lines, run by two separate teams who do not fully trust each other, both apparently still collecting new information more than 5 weeks after Nolan's body was found. Whatever ends up closing the 90-minute gap at the center of this case, if anything ever does, there's a real possibility it comes from one of those calls rather than from the phone dispute we spent most of this video walking through. That is where this case genuinely stands today, not where any single side of the internet says it stands. A mother is still waiting for a cause of death for her son. A group of teenagers who say they love him are still living under public suspicion they say they have not earned. A young woman named Katie has still not spoken for herself. And a handful of commentators on every side of the story are still building entire broadcasts out of the gap that a single completed forensic extraction could, at least partially, start to close. And somewhere between a device sitting in an evidence gap and a 90-minute window nobody has fully explained, the actual answer to what happened to Nolan Wells is still out there, waiting on a process that, whatever you think of its pace, has not stopped moving. Christine Wonsley posted a message to supporters not long ago that had nothing to do with phones, timelines, or grand juries, and it is worth ending on it, because it is the part of this case that every single person arguing online, on every side of every dispute we've covered today, actually agrees on. She described grief as something that arrives in waves rather than a straight line, one moment able to talk about her son's stories and laugh, the next moment unable to breathe under the weight of missing him. She said she didn't know when she would post again, only that talking about him seemed to help, and that she believed Nolan himself would have wanted her to keep telling his story rather than go quiet. That is not a detail that resolves a single disputed fact in this investigation. It is simply true, confirmed by her own words, and it is a part of this story that deserved to outlast every argument about a device sitting in an unresolved evidence gap. We are going to keep tracking every development in this case with the same standard we use today, confirm claims from disputed ones from genuine unknowns, because that is the only version of the story that actually respects both a family looking for truth and a group of uncharged young people whose lives have already been reshaped by a case they did not ask to be at the center of. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old. He cooked salmon for his mother the night before he left for the beach, told her he loved her, and never came home. Whatever this investigation eventually finds, that part of the story is not in dispute. And it's worth remembering that fact just as clearly as every contested one we walk through today. Rest easy, Nolan. This channel isn't going anywhere until his family gets the answers they've been asking for from day one. If you made it this far, you already know this isn't a case with a clean ending yet, and honestly, that's exactly why we needed you to have the full source picture rather than just a version that happens to go viral first. Drop the word answers in the comments if you're planning on sticking around for whenever that phone extraction, that grand jury date, or either autopsy finally lands. Because we're building this channel specifically for people who want to follow a case all the way through instead of just catching the loudest headline and moving on. We'll be here for the next one too. And if that's the kind of channel you want in your corner while this case plays out, subscribing costs nothing, and it's genuinely how we know it worth putting in the hours to keep tracking every twist for you.